Weeping Willow Cottage, Part 2. "If you buy paint, I'll paint my own room," Derek offered one Saturday morning, a few weeks later when we were all home. "Deal," I responded gratefully. "In fact, I just happen to have some sage green that you might like." Apparently, the colour was manly enough for Derek, and he started preparing his room that morning. I was in the kitchen, cleaning out the oven, and Di was folding laundry in her bedroom when Derek came down to the kitchen. He had borrowed a white lab coat from work, and it was now splattered with green paint. I put some newspaper on the kitchen stool so he could sit down, and then joined him on the other one, offering him a mug of coffee. He took a crinkled piece of paper out of one of his pockets. "Here," he said, handing me an old brown and white photograph with white cracks running through it. "I found that when I were pulling out the old heater in me room." Those brutish brown storage heaters full of bricks would have to go when I could afford central heating, but for the time being they took the edge off the winter chill. I studied the photograph of a young girl, her brown hair cascading down in thick waves over her shoulders, huge sad eyes looking out from a small pert face. "It's not mine," I told Derek. "It's old." "Yeah, but it looks like you. When I first saw it, I thought it was you." I flipped it over, but there was no writing on the back. I wonder who she is. I guessed she was about 15. There was something desperate in those eyes, as if she was reaching out to me from the photo. I put it on the counter, away from me. "Probably someone who used to live here," Derek suggested. "Really, Watson?" I smiled at him. "Brilliant." In September, Di's sister Helen came to visit. On the Saturday night, as I stood in the kitchen making a cup of tea to take to bed, both sisters came in the front door arguing. I knew they had been to John's for dinner. When they saw me, they both stopped and stared, embarrassed. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Seen a ghost?" "How did you know?" Helena asked, peering at me. Di put her handbag down and unbuttoned her jacket. "I don't know how to tell you this, Sam, but we just had a séance over at John's." "So, what happened?" I was feeling that familiar unease in the pit of my stomach. "Anybody I know show up?" I teased, trying to lighten the eerie mood. "Oh, it went out, really," Helen said dismissively, plugging in an already steaming kettle. I knew she was trying to spare my feelings, but Di always had to tell the whole truth. It was one of the reasons I liked her so much. "We got hold of a spirit called Samantha." "Yes, Samantha," she confirmed as my eyes widened. "And well, but the message was for me." "What did it say?" "Leave." "What do you mean, leave? Leave where?" "I don't know, Chuck. It just spelled out leave. Leave. Di shuddered at the memory. "You don't think that was me psychically telling you to leave here, do you?" I inquired of Di seriously. No, she replied, hanging up her jacket and avoiding my eyes. "I wouldn't put it past John to rig the whole thing, so he gets to marry you," Helen said, giggling. Di's expression lightened, and she laughed then. "Ah, you're right, kiddo. He did have his hand on that glass pretty tight, didn't he?" "And if I wanted you to leave, which I don't," I said to Di, "I'd tell you to your face, not through some hokey séance, wouldn't I?" "Ah, you would, Chuck." She walked over to the fridge. "Let's have a glass of wine, shall we?" The next morning, as I lay dozing in my bed, I could hear Di and Helen downstairs moving about the kitchen, the kettle being plugged in, and the sisters chatting while waiting for it to boil. The happy sounds were interrupted by a great smash, the sound of china breaking on the floor. With Di around and her penchant for clumsiness, my crockery supply had diminished greatly. She must have dropped another plate or something, I thought. When I joined them downstairs a few moments later, the pieces of a shattered mug lay strewn across the kitchen tiles. Di and Helen, in quilted floral housecoats were standing at the far end of the kitchen, clutching each other and staring at the mug. But the wreckage was over by the washer, 10 feet away from where they huddled. "I didn't do it," Di snapped defensively. "I was down here. It just flew off counter." I believed her. "Will you look at that?" Helen exclaimed, walking across the kitchen and crouching to gingerly pick up the pieces. As she held out the jagged shards of crockery, both Di and I stared. It was Di's own mug, with Diane embossed in gold script on black glaze. Now ragged strips of pottery lay in Helen's hand, each strip with a letter on it, as if someone with very sharp claws had methodically separated each character. Soon after that, Di moved out. For some reason, I was reluctant to find a replacement for Di, maybe because I didn't know how to explain the ghost to a new renter. A month passed before Di came to visit me at Weeping Willow. Her brown eyes shone as she stepped into the doorway, but she was bursting with exciting news. I was just about to pour tea into mugs for us when she displayed a tanned hand in my face, a dainty cluster of white diamonds glistening on her ring finger. She was beaming from ear to ear. "Look, Chuck." "When did this happen?" I asked as I carried the tray with tea and digestive biscuits into the living room. "Last night." She giggled and sat down on the other end of the couch. "What do you think?" "Lovely. It's lovely." I hugged my mug of tea. "When's the happy day?" "Next year, March 18th. I've got so much to do, and in 5 months." She beamed. "Flowers, music, invitations. And better not forget to call Vicar." Di laughed, gulping her drink. I'd rarely seen her so illuminated from within. "Make sure you request that day off," she continued. "David's invited too, of course. Maybe at wedding we'll even give him a bit of a nudge, if you know what I mean, Chuck." She smiled and winked. I knew what she meant all right, but David and I were not even ready to get off first base, let alone discussing marriage. Di's wedding would probably bring him out in a cold sweat. Sleep didn't come easily that night, or I realized any night for that matter. I wasn't sure when I had started dreading coming to my own bed. With Derek away on business again, I was acutely aware of my aloneness. As I tossed and turned in an exhausted attempt at slumber, it occurred to me that when I was away and sleeping in hotels or at friends, I never had the nightmare. Why was that? Maybe, I surmised, it was something to do with the responsibility for owning the house. But I wouldn't think about that now. That night I dreamt about a wedding. David was holding out a ring on a silk cushion to me, while my mother and the rest of my family were cheering and throwing flowers. Everyone was laughing and happy. Suddenly, the scene vanished as someone or something crashed into my dream and lay on top of me, its insidious grouping energy pouring at me. Suffocating, I tried to scream out loud, but no sound came out of my mouth. Ferociously, I fought whatever it was, but I awoke struggling, thrashing at thin air. And as I cried in terror and helplessness, there was no Derek to comfort me. I was alone in the house. Christmas came around again like 100th heartbeat, a dreaded reminder of everything that was missing in my life. David announced that he would be spending Christmas with his family, and apparently that didn't include me. So over the 3-day holiday, I volunteered to do a long-haul flight. On Christmas Eve, while waiting in the crew room for the rest of the LA flight crew, I pinned a card on the notice board, advertising for a new flatmate. Eve Connolly introduced herself to me as one of the crew, and we liked each other instantly. Once on board, as she was ripping tops off cardboard catering boxes in the still cold galley, she told me she was planning to move away from home. That she would become Di's replacement didn't even warrant a discussion. But it wasn't until the whole crew was sitting in Los Angeles' Great American Food and Beverage Disaster restaurant, enjoying steaks and the entertainment of singing waitresses, that Eve talked about her boyfriend Chris, a detective with Hadnam's police force. I didn't know then the strange role he would play in my life. When I returned home, I asked Derek not to scare our new flatmate Eve with tales of the ghost, but she would soon find out from the ghost itself. Meanwhile, my relationship with David was becoming even more tempestuous. I didn't understand why I would suddenly rant at him, saying things I didn't mean. The monster inside me was taking over. I was becoming like my mother with her vengeful, histrionic behaviour, and David had begun to tire of my laments of remorse. One night in January, we had yet another fight, and once again he ended our relationship. This time I knew it was over. The next day, at home in my bedroom, I was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by tapes and records, sorting through all David's gifts to me and placing them in a bag to be returned, when Eve came up the stairs. "I heard you come in last night, you dirty stop-out." She stood in the open doorway, smiling that mischievous grin of hers. "What do you mean?" I asked, a little preoccupied. I wanted to make sure David got everything back. It really was over this time. "You must have been pretty drunk. I heard the front door slam and heard you stagger up the stairs." I stared at Eve. What was she talking about? "I even called out to you," she continued. "What time do you call this then? But you just ignored me, stumbled into your room and slammed the door." Our eyes met. She saw my puzzlement, and her grin faded. We stared at each other for a while. I debated whether to tell her about the ghost. Maybe I was the ghost. Eve finally spoke. "You didn't come home late last night, did you?" I hesitated. "No." "Oh." "David and I broke up for good last night, so I went over to Rosemary's and drank too much wine to drive, so I stayed at her place." Eve's brain was struggling to compute the implications of the noises she had heard. "Look," I began. "This place is haunted, isn't it?" Eve blurted. "Well, it's okay. I can handle it." Her brown eyes bored into mine, needing the truth. "Just tell me." "Let's put it like this," I sighed. "Some people who have lived here think it's haunted." "I knew it." Eve clenched her fist and thrust it into the air as if she had just won something. "Do you think it's haunted?" she almost whispered, as if the ghost might hear us. "It's possible," I admitted grudgingly. In my ambivalence, I hadn't wanted to consider the ghost as something real. It scared me, sometimes gave me the creeps, made me nervous the odd time to stay alone in my own home. But until now, it hadn't really interfered in my daily life. Or had it? Di had moved out because of it, and I had the feeling that something big was going to happen soon. In the meantime, the nightmares were my secret horror. I waited for Eve to tell me that she couldn't live here, that she would have to move. But she just beamed at me. "Well, that certainly makes life more interesting, doesn't it?" I could have hugged her at that moment. Instead I said, "Yes, it certainly does." We both giggled. Eve accepted our invisible flatmate, but I soon noticed that many more doors slammed and more objects moved, apparently by themselves. However, I had the feeling that it wasn't Eve who was affecting the ghost's increased activity, but her boyfriend, Chris. One wintry night, as I returned home, just after 11, I could hear the television still on, so I opened the door to the living room. Eve was sitting in the armchair, as if she was frozen there. Her normally pale mass of freckles now stood out against her ashen face, and her big brown eyes were dilated with fright. She jumped as I entered. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." I smiled, but I noticed that the armchair was pushed back to the far corner of the living room, as if she had been waiting for an attacker to come through the door. "Are you okay?" I asked. She shook her head mutely. "Did you see it?" she asked. I frowned. "See what?" I sat down on the couch and she came and joined me. "What's going on, Eve? Had someone died?" She took a long deep breath before she spoke. "I was sitting here minding my own business. The corners of her mouth curled up in a small smile. My shoulders sagged in relief. No big disaster then. When I heard this almighty great crash, her eyes widened even more until they were like brown satellite dishes. Then I heard a sound like bonk, 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 as if something was coming down the stairs. The previous week, Derek had helped me rip out the old carpet on the upstairs landing, exposing the wooden floor so I could paint the landing and stairway walls. Then a final crash, Eve was saying. So I got up to investigate, as one does, and there it was, just lying there on the floor, unbroken. "What?" "The light bulb," she exclaimed, as if I should know what she was talking about. "What light bulb?" The light bulb in my head wasn't illuminating. "The one from the landing." Eve waved an arm behind her. "You know, the one you couldn't unscrew." She was right. I had struggled for a good half-hour last week to extricate the light bulb that hung from the landing ceiling so I could remove the whole fixture, but it wouldn't budge. I had given up and finally thrown a protective cloth over the lampshade to shield it from stray paint flecks. "Well," Eve continued, "the light bulb just fell out of the socket from that ceiling and crashed to the wooden floor, rolled down those wooden stairs and landed on the hallway boards, without breaking." She puffed indignantly. "Don't you think that's a little odd?" "Downright scary," I agreed. "It should still be there." She jumped up, her perky self again. "Want to see it?" We both stood at the bottom of the wooden staircase in silence, towering over the white light bulb, lying still and miraculously whole on the oak floorboards. The bulbous, misty glass should have appeared harmless enough, but something ominous seemed to emanate from its unbreakable fragility. For the life of me, I couldn't think what. Neither of us ventured to pick it up. "Brr, it's so cold in this house," Eve said, suddenly shuddering as she skirted around the bulb and started up the stairs. "You should think about getting central heating put in." "Funny you should say that," I told her as I followed, leaving the bulb where it lay. I would ask Derek to dispose of it later. I have an appointment tomorrow with a man who installs just that. Eve's boyfriend, Chris, appeared to be the quintessential English detective, well-built, stocky, with a thick moustache and eyes that expressed a permanent cynicism. And, like many detectives who are constantly faced with the horrific side of life, he had a sick sense of humour. He would often shock even me with stories of murders, rapes, and even the secret, gory details of the Yorkshire Ripper's heinous deeds. Eve obviously loved him and would cook an elaborate dinner for Chris almost every night she was home. I wasn't too happy about his constant presence. Not because I didn't like him, I did, but he really seemed to agitate the ghost. Door slamming was now a daily event. Was it because he was male, or was it his individual energy that offended the ghost in some way? Or was the ghost just trying to get someone's attention? Meanwhile, Derek's work sometimes took him away all over the country, and even when he was home he spent a lot of time at his new girlfriend's place. It surprised me how much I missed him. Now constantly imposing on Chris and Eve's romance, I was the piece of the jigsaw puzzle that didn't fit. Chris would frequently go around the house, flicking off lights, turning down the electric heaters, and complaining under his breath, as if he were paying the bills. His behaviour only accentuated even more the feeling that I was an unwelcome stranger in my own home. The sound of wedding bells for Chris and Eve, however, were now ringing loudly. Would it ever be my turn to get married, or was I doomed to the role of perennial landlady? A week later, the painting was finished and all the light fixtures reinstalled. After yet another evening of playing the third wheel, I retreated up the stairs to my bedroom to read. I had turned off the main light in my room, snuggled into bed, and was reading by the glow of my bedside lamp. The landing light was still burning brightly outside my room when I heard the front door open downstairs. Eve and Chris were saying their good nights in the hallway. Kiss, kiss, giggle. His voice, her voice, giggle. The front door opened and closed. Then it happened. My bedroom light came on. Simultaneously, the landing light went off. Chris was playing tricks. He had to be, although I knew he couldn't be downstairs and turn on my bedroom light upstairs. I clambered out of bed, still staring at the offending light, and went to tell Chris I didn't think his joke was very funny. But Eve was already at the top of the stairs. "Was Chris playing with the lights?" I asked. My tone was accusatory. "No, he's gone, and he didn't touch the lights," Eve responded, a hint of indignation in her voice. "Well, Eve, my bedroom light just went on by itself," I exclaimed, "and the landing light went off." "How could that happen?" Eve pushed past me. "Must be something wrong with the switch," she said, and started flicking the light on and off furiously, as if that would fix the problem. "Maybe it's the electrical circuit for all the lights," I offered lamely, sorry that I had snapped at Eve. "Yeah, that's it." "I'll ask Derek." "Yes, ask Derek," she muttered, retreating to her own room, just as disturbed as I was. Later that night, I was awakened by the sound of an older woman's cackling laugh on the landing just outside my door. The beginning of February, I attended a friend's birthday party. As I walked into the kitchen, David was leaning against the counter. When he saw me, to my complete surprise, his eyes lit up. I was even more shocked when he came over and gave me a long hug. We talked. Before the end of the evening, we were back in our relationship. Now we were getting on wonderfully. Whatever had been causing the conflict between us seemed to have evaporated, and we were finally getting closer. On Valentine's Day, I received a vibrant array of flowers. I was happy. Everybody, it seemed, was happy, except the ghost. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" Eve's expressive brown eyes were apprehensive. We were sitting in the living room munching on toasted tuna fish sandwiches. "Yes," I agreed, "it is." We both stared into space. "I've been thinking," I started. "No," Eve jumped on my words, her huge eyes dilating with fear. "An exorcist? No, please don't," she begged. "Why?" I didn't understand Eve's panic. "It'll make it worse." She was emphatic. "Remember the movie The Exorcist?" I contemplated Eve's frightened face. I had been too afraid to see that movie, so maybe she knew something I didn't. "Okay, if you say so," I said, acquiescing. We sat in silence. "By the way, I asked Derek about the lights, and they are all independently wired." "Oh." "What about you two?" one of the other guests at Di and John's wedding inquired, nudging our elbows. With the harmony in our relationship still so new and fragile, I had been afraid this would happen. Well-meaning friends goaded David. "Have you asked her yet? Wink, wink." I groaned inwardly, knowing it might send him over the edge. He couldn't even wait till we were inside Weeping Willow that night before he uttered the words I dreaded. "Samantha," he began, as we sat in his Jeep parked in the dark shadows of my driveway. When he used my full name, I knew it wasn't good news. "You're a great person, but," he muttered, studiously fondling the steering wheel. "I wish I was dead." Despair suddenly washed over me, the words just tumbling out, surprising even me. David groaned. "No, you don't." "What do you know?" I cried, struggling with the Jeep door. "You don't know anything about me." As I stumbled through the front door of the cottage, I realized that after a whole year of dating, David really didn't know anything about me, because he hadn't asked and I hadn't told him. And when I flung myself on my bed that night sobbing, the suspicion crystallized in my mind that I was indeed cursed and would end up a miserable, lonely old woman haunting my own home. In retrospect, what happened then was inevitable, though at the time I didn't see it coming. The black hole was waiting for me. I tumbled right in and kept falling. The family legacy had finally caught up with me. I was crazy like my mother, or that's what I believed. Was the reason I couldn't get out of bed, why my whole body was in excruciating pain, and when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror, while a grey corpse with dead eyes looked numbly back at me. When the phone rang, I would burst into tears. I prayed every night, bargaining with the deity not to make me wake up and face another day of hell, but he didn't listen. After 2 weeks of sleeping most of the day and night, when I eventually crawled out of bed, Di and John came to visit. I saw concern, even fear, in their eyes. They suggested walks in the fresh air, as if that would simply heal my devastated soul. But the sound of their voices grated, their muffled words settling offensively like gobs of meaningless drivel in my ears. I wished they and everybody else would just go away and leave me alone. And even though Derek tried to tempt me with tenderly cooked meals and kept me quiet company in my silent terror, I just wanted to die. When the initial body pain dulled to a throbbing, dull ache, I was still exhausted, but I could feel something shift. The dense fog began to lift. When Derek tentatively suggested he could drive me to the doctor, I was grateful.
"Make sure you mention your nightmares," Derek whispered as we sat in the waiting room.
I liked Dr. Fitzpatrick's cheery but no-nonsense style. He scrutinized me as I shuffled into his office and sank down into the black leather chair. "Are you depressed, Samantha?" he asked straight away. Tears welled up in my eyes and I nodded, surprised at the realization. Why was I depressed? "And are you crying a lot?" I burst out crying in response. "And how are you sleeping?" he continued. I squirmed in my seat. "Not well," I muttered. "What do you mean exactly?" he persisted. "Well, sometimes I have these nightmares," I admitted, remembering Derek's instructions. He was scribbling something on a pad. "Nightmares? They could be a symptom of the depression." Then he looked up. "What are the nightmares about?" I sank further down in my chair, embarrassed.
End of part 2. Join me next week for part 3 and the conclusion of Weeping Willow Cottage.